But if it's not for you, a bit distracting, you can just leave that off. Okay, great. So it's 5 minutes past just now. So I'm just going to say, first and foremost, yeah, thank you so much again for coming along to join this webinar today. We really appreciate you giving your time. And yeah, we've got a really exciting lineup of speakers, so I'm not going to drone on too much because it's not me you're here to listen to. What I'd say is, in the first instance, we do have a great poll question that I would like to put to you guys. Here we go. So we'll just give a minute to this question. So we want to ask you, which of these do you think represents the greatest threat to basking sharks? So we have a few points here. We have everything from pollution to ships. We have offshore development, climate change. Feel free to just give that just a wee minute, and we'll just get a rough read of the room just to see how people feel about that. Okay, so answers are coming in quite quickly. It seems like there's no real strong contender. Everyone's selected one at least. Fishing and aquaculture seems quite high, as does pollution and climate change. Interesting. Okay. Well, what we'll do is we will find out if that's the case, hopefully, in this session as we talk about some of the threats that basking sharks face. So without further ado, I'm going to hand over just now to our first speaker, who is Colin Speedie. So Colin Speedie is a basking shark researcher with over 40 years of expertise to share. So we all have lots we can learn from Colin. So many hats, everything from professional yacht skipper to team leader on yacht-based research projects, former director of the Wildlife Trust's Basking Shark Project, author of A Sea Monster's Tale in Search of the Basking Shark, and director of the WISE scheme, which Colin will talk about a bit as well. So Colin, I'll hand over to you.
Thank you. Right, can you all see that, I hope?
Yes, we
yeah.
can.
Okay, great. Okay, well, thank you very much for that. The welcome, Eloise, that's great. You know who I am. Well, here's some information on the basking shark. The basking shark, Cerpan in Gaelic and Moldoan in Scots, which is the old Aberdeenshire term. The second largest fish in the world, can reach up to 11 meters in length, perhaps even 12 meters. We've got some reliable sources from records in Canada. 50 years is a rough guide to the age. They might live a little longer. They feed only on zooplankton, small living animal plankton, and they appear in our waters in spring and summer, although it varies. It's an amazing creature. The basking shark, like the white shark and perhaps tiger shark, can make these enormous long-distance migrations from right across the Atlantic. So a shark tagged in the Isle of Man some years ago surfaced again off Newfoundland, having covered nearly 10,000 kilometers. They also have a phenomenal ability to dive very deep. In fact, they can dive more than 1,264 meters, we know now. And they are constantly searching for plankton. Plankton just doesn't disappear. It just goes out into deeper water, sometimes in the winters, for example, and the sharks keep feeding for it. Sharks tagged by researchers in New England also cross the equator and surface off southern Brazil. So we know that it can make a trans-equatorial passage as well. So this is quite remarkable stuff, but they were hunted very, very severely in the last century, and they're classified as endangered in the Northeast Atlantic and now, I believe, globally as well. But the waters of the west of Scotland have always been important for basking sharks and may well be of vital importance for the future. This is an example of a very early shark hunt. This was in Thomas Pennant's Journey to the Hebrides book, 1774. And there's an interesting thing here. In the very early days, everybody thought the basking sharks were hunted either by driving them ashore in fisheries or roping them with nets. But actually, the early industrialized fisheries, and that's what this is these are the sailing vessels are catcher ships, and the guys in the rowing boats going out and hand harpooning the shark are the catcher crews. So this was already a well-developed fishery And quite a lot of money was spent by the Scottish government of the day in providing grants and funding for people to actually start to hunt basking sharks. A number of good reasons for this. But there were fisheries out in the Outer Hebrides, which were on a small scale, low-key basis, same sort of thing that exists to this day in the Faroe Islands, driving sharks ashore. But there were particular people who applied for grant funding. Donald MacLeod at Canna, David Campbell at Isla, the Stewart of Bute in Tarbert and Loch Fyne, and these guys all got substantial amounts of money to buy vessels and small boats and to employ crews to go out and catch basking sharks. So it was already a really serious enterprise. So why would you go to that kind of trouble and, huge amount of expense? Well, the shark has two enormous livers in its body, which act as a hydrostatic organ, help the shark maintain its position in the water. And they yield a very, very rich and valuable oil, very low freezing point. It's a really, really attractive engineering oil, light engineering oil. And it's even used to this day in some rockets. But it was used by the locals as liver oil for embrocation, rubbing it on wounds and injuries, tanning and currying leather, quenching iron and steel for machining as a machine oil, and lighting. That was where the big money was. But lighting was for use in little oil burning lamps out in the black houses in the Hebrides and ashore. But that was because it burnt very cleanly and very brightly, but it didn't have a lot of smell or smoke. So it was very popular, as was whale oil for that. And the skin was used as a primitive form of sandpaper because it has tooth-like denticles on it, and you can use it to form wood and that kind of thing. So the hunting continued throughout in Scotland until around 1830, where it seemed to just disappear off the market. And there were a number of factors for that. Whale oil was increasing in abundance and was therefore able to compete with basking shark oil, and the price went down. The sharks also disappeared for quite a long time from the popular records. And that was despite the fact there were still being substantial prizes being paid as subsidies for the amount of liver oil you actually produced. So it does seem that the sharks moved away for a while. And then suddenly in 1935-36, there was an explosion of sharks, both in the Irish Sea, the Firth of Clyde, and in the Sea of the Hebrides. And there were sharks everywhere. And people were asking questions in Parliament about the infestation of sharks. So drastic action was called for. But in the meantime, some what you might call gentlemen adventurers picked up the baton and decided to go hunting. First of which was a guy called Anthony Watkins in the Firth of Clyde, then the famous writer Gavin Maxwell after the war, Tex Geddes, who was Maxwell's harpoon gunner, Patrick Fitzgerald O'Connor from Col, and many, many Norwegian boats. And this is a significant factor. And some fishing vessels from Malig also took part. This is the little basking shark factory in the Firth of Clyde, just north of Carradale. This was pre-war, and these sharks are being livered. That gentleman in the foreground is cutting the livers out, and they will be heated and the oil extracted and barreled and sent away. Meanwhile, the Norwegians started to appear over in Scottish waters, and those vessels have a black ring on their crow's nest, were also used for minke whale hunting. And these were extremely experienced people, very well equipped. But why did they come all this way? If they had so many sharks, why would they come this distance? And this was an interesting thing. Latterly, sharks continued to be hunted right up until 1994, and could have been hunted till the cessation of shark hunting altogether in 1998 by an act of government. So this is one of the last sharks caught in British Isles. So the scale of the catch, in Scotland, it was just about 1,000 sharks. In one bay alone in Ireland, in Achill, Keem Bay, nearly just over 12,000 sharks were taken, 1947 to 75, which was a devastating amount. But Norway took 67,000 and odd, and that was definitely under representation. And traveled all the way to build the numbers back up, because they basically fished out their own areas. That's one theory. Another theory is the sharks moved. There's probably truth in both. But the fact is that the Norwegians wouldn't have traveled all this distance for no good reason. So the true figures were much, much higher because the Norwegians reported their catches in weight of oil as against the length of the shark in an erroneous manner, and also with the fins latterly. Fins were the most expensive and valuable part later. So when we came to create the Wildlife Trust Basking Shark project, which involved Scottish Wildlife Trust, we were looking at history. I spent a lot of time studying where the sharks had been and building up a case to go and survey these areas in a random manner. So we were using what are called line transect surveys to see whether there were still shark hotspots around the areas that the subsidized fisheries had been. We had to cover the whole area to make sure that we weren't biasing it, but that's basically what we did, nearly 12,000 kilometers of surveys. And this is what we found. So you can see here where the red markings are, those were areas of really significant value where we consistently, year on year, saw lots and lots of sharks. We measured it in sharks per unit effort, sharks per hour that we saw. Normally, it's something like 0.001 in the open water. By comparison, we had sightings of nearly 5 an hour, which is absolutely extraordinary. The other thing, too, was that in these specific areas was where we saw big shoals predominantly. In fact, almost exclusively. In those big shoals, too, and in those areas as well, that's where we saw big sharks, which are mature reproductive animals. So this is a place where you find big groups of sharks of significant size for mating and reproduction, rebuilding the population. And we saw lots of interesting behavior like this, which we call courtship-like behavior, where the sharks swim nose to tail, sometimes in dozens and dozens of them, and occasionally rubbing against each other. So this is a really, really interesting area. And also, too, we saw other social behavior like breaching, where they leap clear of the water. They are spectacular breachers, tremendous bang when they come down. And we're pretty convinced that it must have some larger region than just dislodging parasites or something of that nature. So this is what was so great about all those areas, and this is what it amounted to. And effectively, this was the argument that we then put forward in a report for the then Scottish Natural Heritage in 2009, arguing the hotspot status of these particular sites. Now that led to whole new areas of research, which Shane will enlarge on. In this case, we have Phil Doherty multitasking, where he's attaching a satellite tag on one side of the fin, and he's also wiping with that windscreen, that window wiper, to take slime off the shark for DNA sampling. And what we've learned over the years is that the sharks don't just come here and then stay for 5 minutes and clear off. Many of them stay for months, some return year on year, and gradually that's built the picture that says what we have here is something special. The remnants of hunting are still there. It is an extraordinary history, and it's unique to Scotland. We know more about the Scottish shark fishery than any other. And with that knowledge and the knowledge from history, we've used that to develop conservation measures and move forward and try and help the basking shark for the future. Over to you, Shane.
Thanks very much for that, Colin. Yeah, that was really informative. Yeah, we'll just hand over to Shane just now. So many of you will know from our description what Shane's about. So Shane is the founder of Basking Shark Scotland, passionate marine biologist, enthusiastic snorkeler, dive instructor, a great deal of expertise in everything from guiding, being a skipper, photographer. He's worked in many different fields, including fisheries, aquariums, underwater travel photography, even shipwreck disaster response. So really exciting amount of expertise from Shane. If you're ready, Shane, we'll hand over to you.
Good evening, everyone. Well, that was thanks for that welcome. I don't think I'm that impressive. Let's just stop the screen share and continue. Okay, let's get this going. Right. Hope everyone can see that. Give me a thumbs up if you can, or a yes.
Yes, we can.
Great. All right. Well, hopefully Colin has given you a brilliant introduction. There's a couple of areas where we kind of overlap, so I'll try my best to kind of cut our time down because we're short of time. But we, Basking Shark Scotland, which I founded about 10 years ago, Primarily run bass and shark tours, but with my background in marine biology, I was very keen to use the opportunity to gather lots of data and information, because we've got a really unique opportunity to spend lots of time out beside the sharks, where researchers only get a certain budget and can only spend so much time, whereas we're in the field every single day. So that's really great. And obviously the guru, as we know him, Colin, has trailblazed a lot of the surveys, which was great. But with basking sharks, you never know what they're doing 1 minute to the next. So there is a very random element to them as well. So as well as the tours, we're obviously doing lots of research, conservation, advocacy, talks like this. And we also, a couple of years ago, started a basking shark podcast. So if you're a real basking shark fan, you can listen to us wax lyrical about all sorts of basking shark nonsense. Now, as Colin said, I've kind of highlighted the area where we've seemed to have had the most amount of sharks. And then, as following on from him, it is an area of world importance for basking sharks during the summer. So we have huge numbers coming here. And the big question is, how do we find them? And this is a lot of subtleties in finding the old sharks. You might think it's quite easy from all the videos and pictures I'm going to show you, but I can guarantee you it's not, telling from the wrinkles and all the grey hairs in my head. As Colin said, they do huge migration, so generally they travel to and from us. And here's a couple of pictures of the satellite tags, one that Colin mentioned, Mova's Gore, which was tagged and went across the Atlantic, which is really cool, and a more recent one from Matt Witt at Exeter, where that one stayed on long enough that it travelled all the way down to the Canaries. So generally subtropics and back to get to us in summertime. Now, the Hebrides, if you don't know much about it, is a beautiful archipelago of islands, and this looks a bit more Caribbean than Scotland, but I can also guarantee you it's a tumultuous place. And I've taken many a wave in our search for the big fish. But usually after the storm comes through, we get some lovely rainbows and scenes at sea, and then this is our pot of gold. So sometimes when the weather calms down, we do get a shark at the end of the rainbow. There's a lot of time doing this, stand at the back of the boat, searching, and just because it's lovely calm weather doesn't just mean that there's lots of sharks around. So frustratingly, in these conditions, it's absolutely A1 conditions to look for sharks. Obviously lots of whales and dolphins to keep us entertained in the meantime, but you would think it would be really good conditions. It does make spotting easier. We can see a long way when it's nice and calm, but they won't go into this tonight. I've got a very good blog on it if you'd like to know, but basking sharks are a bit of a misnomer because there's not any basking going on, certainly. It's all to do with the food, and we generally see a lot of sharks in rough weather, which is more of a Hebrides picture than the kind of flat cam sunny ones. And one thing that we get asked lots and trying to explain to people is just because there's no sharks on the surface doesn't mean they aren't there. So what I mean by that, it's a very good term coined by David Sims, that basking sharks are on an energetic knife edge. So they eat these tiny plankton and they have to swim around all the time eating this to gain enough energy. And you can imagine how much energy it takes for them to swim along with that huge mouth open. You can imagine swimming along yourself with a big plyboard in front of you and how much effort it would take to swim against the water. So you can imagine that they only feed in optimal conditions. And then this is quite a good video to illustrate. It's a bit slowed down, one from the drone. So at this point, the shark's underwater. So drones has really opened what we can see. It wasn't feeding. You can tell there its mouth is closed, but it's got to an optimal area of plankton. The dorsal fin's broken the surface, and then you can just see it flaring its gills and then starting to feed. So they generally feed when it's optimal conditions. The top right picture there is an area where we've been sampling plankton. The right is where, if you're looking at it, or I'm looking at it, hopefully it's not mirrored for you. The one with lots of plankton is where they feed, and the one where it's slightly less is they don't. So they look for an area of optimal plankton density, but also in size. So they like the adult version, so they're getting more bang for their buck. So a lot of the time we kind of say that, if they're in an area of current and they're going down current, they could probably feed in areas where there's less plankton. But if they're having to swim into the current and expend a bit more energy, they'll generally only feed when it's in an area where there's much more there, which kind of makes sense. So this is our kind of day job ish. obviously nice, pretty pictures. But as I said before, there's a bigger picture to this. So we collaborated a lot with different universities and different researchers. Again, as I said, we've got a very good opportunity to gather information. And certainly in the last 10 years, there's been an exponential understanding of basking sharks, which is cool. So we do a lot of swimming with the sharks, and in that time we get lots of information. So we look at scarring on them. So I'm not sure if you know how sharks mate, but they kind of bite onto each other, and we see a lot of scarring on the fins from that. We've seen a lot of piloting, which is little fish that's swimming along beside them. It's quite interesting. We've been looking at the lateral line and the patterns on them to try and match sharks. They have a lot of parasites, both copepod parasites, which you can't really see in this one. They're little ones, you might see them, the other ones, but also these sea lampreys. So looking at different parts of their body and how many, and also sex in the sharks. So obviously we gain size as well. So how many males, how many females, what size are they, things like that. So that's providing a very big data set. And when we started, technology now is far more or far better than it was back in the day. So here is a very good example of just basic camera citizen science. So in 2013, the top left picture, we saw the shark, which we named Sorenose, which actually had a plastic packing strap wrapped around its nose and obviously couldn't get it off, which is terrible. We didn't actually see it again, and that was it, and we hoped that it was going to be okay. Interestingly enough, the next year or the next season, we saw it within 5 miles and 10 days of the last sighting. So what we know now from all the futuristic technologies that are showing the sharks coming back to the same shores, this was a very good example of showing that just through pictures. We also get things like we work with the guys in Ireland. So there's the Irish Basking Shark Group. They tagged a shark in April 2020, and then we saw it in August. And I think this was the first visually confirmed one that had been seen in both locations. It had very distinct notch on its dorsal fin, and also the tag we managed to just kind of clean it off to get a kind of ID. So that was really cool to see that one. We've done a lot of surface photo ID. So this is kind of like a fingerprint of a basking shark. So you can hopefully tell that it's an individual and monitor that over the next few days or in following seasons. And as Colin alluded to with some of the genetic stuff, we've been doing that as well, providing lots of slime samples to get lots of information about the sharks traveling in family groups and things like that. So that's a really good project, that one. One question, are basking sharks just feeding in our waters? So they're obviously well known with their mouth open, which is the kind of classic view, feeding away, but there is lots of other things that they do, and Colin alluded to some of that, which I'll get into just now. Interestingly, a lot of the observations, we felt, this is one of our papers that we published, some of the observations from the surface didn't always marry up with what was going on underwater, and comparing it to maybe other species like manta rays, we found that a lot of the behaviors of them following each other was a lot of the time feeding and potentially not courtship. But you go further down the track and you learn more and more things, and the more you go down the track, the less you think you know about it, and the more we kind of understand that it's very subtle, some of the things that basking sharks do, and not quite so black and white kind of thing. As Colin talked about, this is a video of one of the sharks breaching. You can imagine it takes a lot of energy to do that, and probably the sharks don't do that just for a bit of fun. It's probably to do with something, and most people or researchers believe it's something to do with mating. Some interesting facts about that is that they actually can jump at speeds similar to a white shark, and they're in the kind of same order as those guys. But that's, I think the guys are sharing some scientific papers, which you could have a read on that. Some really interesting stuff. I think it was up to about kind of 5 meters per second, which is about 10 kilometers an hour. This is another paper we're involved in from 2020, a thing called Taurus, and I think Colin's referred to it as the wheel. And when we get the sharks close, swimming together in a big circle, and then descending into the water, it seems like this is a kind of pre-mating ritual that we believe. This is a video of it. We came across it one day. Interestingly, the sharks were all swimming in a line, feeding away, quite happy. They swam up to our snorkelers. We'd put them in well ahead and a very low impact protocol, and then they formed this circle behavior and did this for about 10 minutes while the guys were very still in the water, and just watched them go back. This is a really interesting one. It's a very large male with big claspers, which is the boy bits of a shark, and very dark, and these are some of the Some of the analytics that has been done into this have found these really subtle behaviours about, say, colour change and maybe nodding and different things, which is really interesting. And obviously video technology has opened up that kind of research, which is cool. So on a little bit to threats. I'm not sure how my time's going, but I'll try and get through this section. We see firsthand the impact of plastics out there. We do some beach cleans in bad weather. We pick up stuff from the boat. We've done some ghost net stuff, which is divers coming and pulling nets off shipwrecks. And this is next to one of our really impressive locations that we go to, a big waterfall. And these exposed shores on the west coast and many other places get this debris washing up, which is heartbreaking to see it. And we organised a couple of years ago a huge expedition beach clean. 53 cubic meters of stuff came off that beach. It took us about 4 trips back and forward, ferrying everyone back and forward with the dinghy ashore and taking surf and all these things. And this is all because we see firsthand what kind of effects it has. So drone footage on the left of the sharks swimming along a tide line, and that is kind of known as a tidal front, which concentrates plankton, and the sharks seek this out to feed, as we said before. They find the rich areas to feed in, but it's also the area we see beside all these lion's manes jellyfish that it also concentrates plastics. So a little pilot study we've been doing over the last few years, sampling obviously plankton and plastic, looking for microfibers and all the microplastics it's contained to see if there is, a risk to the basking sharks while they're feeding in these areas. And here's a little takeaway comment from our pilot study. This was in the Firth of Clyde near Arran. So we know what volume we sampled with the net, how much plastic we got, what the basking shark's feeding rate is, and if the basking sharks was feeding in this area at those known figures, it would be ingesting 440 grams of plastic an hour. Now, it's probably not doing that, but even a tenth or 100th of that, you can imagine that it must have some effect down the track because they've got a very intricate stomach anatomy. There hasn't been very many that wash up that can have stomach contents analysis, so that's a bit of data that's missing. But certainly we would like to extend this study to gather more data on that. Interestingly, we've done a comparison between the Hebrides and the Clyde, and the Clyde obviously having a third of the Scottish population is naturally going to have much more stuff. What can we do about this? Obviously, I'm sure you guys all know about plastics and rubbish going into the ocean. This is a really nice example. I spent many years in New Zealand. I really like this, which they have in all their drain covers over there, which says the drains are just for rain, and it really nails down that when everything goes into stormwater in the drains, it just ends up in the ocean. And obviously they have these stormwater catchments where they're catching all the stuff before it goes into the ocean. So beach cleans are great, but we shouldn't really need to do them. We need to stop it going in before it gets in there. So a few little takeaways. They're only too negative, but it's sometimes hard for people to grasp, what they can do, from their off their own back and things like that. So obviously celebrating basking sharks and our successes in protection and conservation. We obviously have the world's first MPA. We've been long protected by them. We've got very good information like the WISE scheme on people acting appropriately around them, whether that's commercial or recreational people. So there's a little plug for one Colin's courses, really great. So I'd encourage you to do that. We obviously, a good thing would be to encourage initiatives to stop plastics entering into the oceans and obviously getting into the places where basking sharks are feeding. If you feel like you would like to join us, then we're kind of doing modern day studies, so feel free to maybe join one of our research expeditions and get involved in some of that. And one of the big picture things is the type of plankton that the sharks eat is moving north because of global sea warming. So that's a big picture thing that we can't do too much about with, obviously ever makes a big difference. Great, but that's a big thing that we could do with tackling. So I think that's over my 10 minutes. Hopefully I've squeezed all that in. So yeah, thanks for listening. Feel free to chuck in some questions later.
Thanks very much, Shane. That was a lot of information, which was all fantastic to hear. Yeah, no, it was absolutely. I think everyone on the call can agree that a talk on basking sharks could go on for hours and hours, couldn't it? There's just so much information, so much exciting information to share. So while Rebecca is getting set up with her slides, I'd like to just really briefly pop over to a poll. We'd like to see if we can answer this question here. So marine protected areas, which of the following statements comes closest to your view? So you've heard of them and you know a lot, you've heard of them but you know a little, or you've just never heard of them before. So I'll just give that a wee minute while Rebecca loads her screen. And to introduce Rebecca, Rebecca is our Marine Policy Officer for the Scottish Wildlife Trust. Again, a really fantastic amount of expertise. Rebecca's been involved in everything from policy work to community engagement to surveying. So we're really grateful to have Rebecca on the call and in our team. There we go. So having a look at this, it looks like a lot of people have heard of them but don't know too much. So Rebecca, over to you.
Grant, thank you, Eloise. Yep, so I'm just going to keep my camera off just to the internet in Orkney is not too great, so I'm going to try and just make sure that my audio stays okay. So hopefully you can all see my screen. And yeah, I'm just going to take you through just quickly to end off the session before we go into the Q&A, looking at MPAs, what they are, how they relate to basking sharks, and also to the wider policy work of the Scottish Wildlife Trust. There we go. So marine protected areas, the purpose of them is to safeguard nationally important species, habitats and geology across Scotland's marine environment, particularly in terms of basking sharks. Obviously, you know, correctly identifying critical areas for mobile species like basking sharks is a lot more challenging than for, you know, low mobility species or obviously static features like habitats, you know, like seagrass or coral beds or things like that. Getting the right areas for mobile species like basking sharks requires research, monitoring, all of the great things that Shane and Colin have just spoken about. So in Scotland, the Scottish MPA network covers 37% of our seas, and it comprises a few different types of marine protected area. So we have 231 sites for nature conservation. As I say, they protect a broad range of different habitats and species. We also then have 5 other area-based measures which protect species such as sand eels and also other vulnerable marine ecosystems. There's also a demonstration and research MPA around Fair Isle that's looking to investigate factors affecting seabird populations there. And there are also 8 historic MPAs that preserve sites of historical importance around the coast. So moving on to one that relates to basking sharks specifically. We have one around the seas of the Hebrides, which was designated in 2020, in particular for basking sharks, but also for other species such as minke whale. And as I say, it recognises the importance of this area for basking sharks. And basking sharks are also recognised as what is called a priority marine feature within Scotland's seas, which are a list of 81 different species and habitats that was collated in 2014. So Shane kind of touched on some of the impacts to basking sharks, so particularly things like plastics, as he mentioned, boat strikes, and also interaction with, you know, disturbance from boats and that kind of thing are sort of recognised as being, you know, sort of 2 main threats to basking sharks within the seas, and, you know, looking at giving them greater protection for that. Moving on to something that's a little bit newer. So highly protected marine areas are part of the new programme for government in Scotland. So they have set out that they want to designate these highly protected marine areas for at least 10% of Scotland's seas. And the work to designate these, as I say, HPMAs or highly protected marine areas, the work will begin in 2023, so this year, to find the most appropriate locations for these, and the designations will come in around 2026. So it's all quite a new process that's happening right now. So the aims of HPMAs will be to facilitate ecosystem recovery, to enhance benefits that coastal communities derive from the sea, contribute to mitigation of climate change, and also support resilience of marine ecosystems. So these can either overlap with existing MPAs, they may also be located out with the current MPA network. So there's a lot of scope there. And it's hoped that these HPMAs will significantly increase the overall level of protection within Scotland's seas. And in terms of the Trust's view on this, you know, finding the balance between, you know, industry developments and marine ecosystem recovery will really be the greatest challenge going forward, especially within marine planning for the next couple of years, particularly for things like offshore wind, given Scotland's role in its key role in Scotland trying to achieve its ambitious net zero targets. So a lot of things happening within the marine environment, and so it's working out how best we can protect our marine species while all of this is going on, and ensuring that industry growth is appropriately located and does not hinder conservation efforts is going to be a vital part of marine conservation and policy work over the next few years. So I've got a couple of documents there that you can go and look at. So the Ocean Recovery Plan and the Nature Recovery Plan. Ocean Recovery Plan that was that the Trust worked on with the Scottish Environment Link, and also the Nature Recovery Plan that has been developed jointly also between Scottish Wildlife Trust, WWF and RSPB Scotland. They give a bit more information about highly protected marine areas and where we're looking at working over the coming years. Particularly if you're interested in this and the designating of sites and feeding back to the government on this, there is a current consultation happening. So if you search ScotGov consultations and search for highly protected marine areas, then you'll be able to hopefully find that consultation, and it ends at the end of March for responses. So good opportunity there to get in your views on these. And then quickly, just to end off, a couple of things that are happening. There is the Sea Scotland conference that's coming up in June. Before that, there's a couple of things happening, including an event for young people. So for people aged, I think it's 18 to 25, yep. There will be an event at the Montrose Basin on the 4th of March. So these places are filling up really quickly. So head over to Eventbrite and search Sea Scotland if you would like to book one of those places. That's an in-person event. There'll also be an online youth event on the 8th of April, and tickets for the main event in June will also be available soon. So worth keeping a look at the Sea Scotland channels. And finally, if you would like to come along to any of our other webinar series that this is part of, we have a few more coming up over the next couple of months. So again, have a look on Eventbrite, and yeah, we'd love to see you again at some of our other webinars. Thank you.
Thanks very much, Rebecca. That's fantastic. So we still have 5 minutes left on our call. We really do want to open this up to Q&A. And actually, our guest speakers today have been so kind in their time, and they have offered to stay on the call for a few minutes extra, just so anyone who has any burning questions can have them answered. So for those of you who do have to go 1:45, please do. But if you would like to stay on for an extra few minutes to answer some questions and things like that, that'd be great. So yeah, having a look at the Q&A just now, I think first and foremost, if the speakers maybe want to pop your cameras on again, I think it's always nicer when you can see some faces in these calls. Good stuff. And let's have a wee look at the Q&A just now. So I can see that Shane has answered a few questions already, which has been fantastic. So let's just work through them. So first question we have here is for Shane, and it's from Amy. And it says, basking sharks and sharks in general are often thought of as quite mysterious creatures. What's your favourite basking shark behaviour that you've witnessed? And Shane has commented on that already, actually. So yeah, just to say for anyone who's maybe wanting to have a look at that, Shane mentioned, well, I don't want to speak on your behalf, Shane, but do you want to talk on your experience? Oh, if you could turn your microphone on as well.
I think you could also ask the guru, because in a recent podcast, I think one of his memories is actually very similar to mine. And I think, if you're, I guess we're both shark nuts and had spent so much hours out in that area. So, you do get these amazing opportunities. And I think we can maybe let him allude to his one as well, because it's very similar. I think his evening off of high skier.
Yeah, we were out at, it was late in the season, September, and we just had a really nice spell of weather for a few days. And we were out at the high skier late of an evening, knowing that the weather was going to go bad the next day. And the high skier is in the middle of nowhere between Rum and Barra. And we had a huge number of sharks. I couldn't say how many there were, but hundreds, 500 more. As far as the eye could see, we could see little fins. Even with binoculars, right out in the Minch, we could see fins. It was just amazing. And imagine that you were in the middle of Africa in the Serengeti, and as night was falling, there was a huge herd of elephants. And that's the scale it's on. And the basking sharks are our elephant. Aren't we lucky?
Brilliant. And having had a look at the Q&A as well, we've got a few more questions popping in. So I wonder if we can try and answer some of those. Rory has a very interesting question to open up to the group. So, well, oh, sorry, Rory's question here is actually, what's your favourite experience with basking sharks? There we go. Does anyone like to share any stories on that, or?
I'll give you another one if you like. One of my dreams running a boat, which is expensive, is that we had so many sharks around that I didn't have to move anywhere. And one particular day, 2015, we had a bay, because sometimes what happens is you have, say, an onshore wind for a few days, and it concentrates the plankton into one little area. And there was about 20 sharks in this one little bay, and we kind of anchored just on the outside of it and just turned the engines off and just stayed there for about kind of 6 or 8 hours. And the sharks were just going back and forward and back and forward, back and forward. We don't have to go anywhere. And it was just absolutely, and it was one of the days, sunny, flat cam. It was unbelievable. You get these little, it can be hard, it's the not the calmest of areas to work in, but when you get these nuggets, these really golden times, it's as good as anywhere in the world, those experiences, and very few people get to kind of see those kind of things. So that was one of my really good memories.
I'd like to add to that with Shane. When you get calm conditions like that, what a lot of people don't realize is that you can smell the decaying plankton. And you've got such a sense of the presence of the sharks, and just hear the swish of the tail as they go by. It's quite remarkable.
And it's incredible to think that these ocean giants are right on our doorstep as well. We often think that we have to venture to more exotic places to appreciate and experience wildlife like that. So yeah, it does give you a moment of reflection to remember that. The question that I was sort of looking at in the first instance, I can see, was actually from Steve, and it's around HPMAs, and it says, how will fishermen react to HPMAs? I wonder if perhaps maybe Rebecca, first and foremost, because you mentioned HPMAs a little bit, do you have any thoughts on that at all?
So I think, like with any marine conservation efforts, there's always going to be conversation with different industries. So it all kind of links back as well to marine planning, there's also a lot of new updates with marine planning coming through, like a consultation on the National Marine Plan that's going to be coming up over the next few years. So lots of things happening, and I'm sure lots of conversations with industries like fishermen, but then all interested industries. As I said, offshore wind is going to be a big one as well. So I think when it comes to MPAs and our kind of advocacy work, it's very much about kind of putting forward that sort of scientific background of policy, and why why it's important to protect the seas, why it's important to have conservation areas, limiting certain things, and just trying to sort of push that angle as much as we can, while also keeping dialogues open with other marine users, because obviously it's very difficult to try and do things in the marine environment if you don't have everybody on board. So a lot of policy and advocacy work coming up in the next few years, I think, with all the new things that are happening, especially within the new programme for government. So it's going to be an interesting space for sure.
Does anyone else have any comments on that question, or will I move on
I've
to another
seen quite a few negative aspects from local fishermen in the islands. I don't think they've taken to it particularly well, but I'm not sure if it's maybe because nothing's really came out about it properly yet, and it's a threat to them and things like that. But certainly the folk we know, because obviously we work with fishermen who give us sightings, and they're part of the community in the islands. They've, from what I've seen anyway, they are not particularly happy. But I think it's more as education is the problem. They don't really realise that. I don't think it would affect them. Well, personally, I don't think it would affect them for the places. And this was generally creel fishermen that I'm talking about. Maybe there's mobile gear and things that would have more effect, but. I did kind of think about trying to get involved and trying to appease some of their things, but I thought, I'm going to leave that leave that to someone else.
Yeah, I think it's definitely a very a difficult area, but as you say, there's a lot of really constructive conversations going on, and actually a lot of really fantastic people working in the fishing industry who are actually taking steps to be sustainable in the way that they operate, because at the end of the day, it's a case of and it's an industry that's important to Scotland, and it's an industry that we don't want to lose, but we just want to manage it in a sustainable way. And I think that a lot of fishermen and people in that industry are aware of that, and are taking measures to address that as well. So I think it's just about opening the lines of communication as much as we can. So many great questions coming in now. So there's one I think that has popped up in the chat box a little bit too. So what actions can we take as citizens when it comes to marine conservation? Who would like to go for that one?
Well, I would have a couple of things. One is get involved. Don't wait for everybody else to start or you get permission. Just go out, join a local group, and become involved. I started out as a citizen scientist, and indeed, worked very closely with people as volunteers on our boat who were citizen scientists. So, just don't sit there on a bar stool full of beer and good intentions. Get out there and do something.
Yeah, great advice. I mean, sometimes it can feel a bit overwhelming when you think about how many issues there are and where you can contribute, where you feel like you can have value to add to what's going on. But yeah, I think that everyone in the call, I'm sure, would say that actually just taking the first steps to even just find out what's going on. Like speak to people, maybe locally. If someone's doing something that really interests you, then reach out and ask for more information, because you'll be amazed at how excited people are to actually talk about their work and enthuse more people about it too. Any more comments on that question, or will I zip along? We have a question here around how long does it take basking sharks to reach maturity, and do we have a mix of adults and juveniles around Scotland in the summer?
Well, I scribbled an answer to that, which is that the males about 15 to 16 years, it's believed, and the females slightly older. There's they have a form of delayed implantation. They can mate with multiple females can mate with multiple males. I'm sure Shane and his diving team have been noting, that you see a lot of females with injuries around the cloaca that indicate, recent mating, because the male has a big hook on the end of each clasper. So that's it. And one of the other parts of that question was, we do see a mix. The hunters used to take more females than males, which might be because the females were slightly larger in the overall shoal mix, or slightly further up in the water column. But when we were seeing big shoals, as far as we could see, and we were nothing like as effective as Shane as his team are, it looked like we had a reasonable mix of the two. Shane?
Interestingly, I've not got too much time to get into the things of it, but certainly we are seeing these days, compared to your earlier surveys, much smaller sharks, which is interesting, because all these things just open up so many more questions. So obviously younger sharks than what Colin had seen. So the question is, where has the older sharks moved to? Have they moved to another area? Are they just not in that space at that time? It obviously gives us evidence that there has been maybe not recovery, but there has been breeding going on, that younger ones are kind of coming through. But you tend to kind of go along one track, try and answer one question, and then by the time you get to the end, you've got 20 more questions to try and think about on that. But yeah, certainly the size class that we are seeing is probably like 4 to 6, a 7 to 8 would be a kind of big one for us. And there's differences at different times of year, like the first arrivals. We tend to get a different mix when there's lots around, which would potentially be courtship when we've got more males and females together. Sometimes earlier season we've had like more females come up, kind of thing. So there's lots of theories about kind of like little scouting groups that come up and then head off. But as someone said, they're so mysterious. There's so many elements to it, and what they do is so subtle, and it's got so much influence from climate and weather systems, and what's going on in the Pacific with La Nina and El Nino and all these kind of things, that it's a huge thing to try and tackle and understand. It's a massive jigsaw, and we only just get this small little window of it in the summertime to kind of try and get a snapshot of what's going on. So.
I mean, Shane's absolutely right with that. I mean, there are factors such as El Nino and the North Atlantic Oscillation, which actually divert plankton to different regions, depending on whether the NAIO is positive or negative. But what I really like about the things that Shane's doing is that he's doing them all the time. You've got year-on-year research, replicable, and you're seeing these little trends happening. And I utterly agree with everything he says. It's subtle. And sometimes when you get this shift and you find yourself around these big shoals, it's a different world. But what's happening otherwise is equally important, especially because it may shed light on reproductive success. And that's going to be the critical factor, because over 100,000 sharks taken in 50 years at the end of the last century is going to take some rebuilding. They never were that numerous.
Great, thank you, Colin. And I'm having a look at the Q&A box just now, and it seems like we've only really got maybe 1 or 2 questions we haven't answered yet. There's one here from Captain Steve who said, when these sharks are migrating, would they be considered more of a solo or pod migration? And then here in Cape Breton, we've only really seen solo basking sharks, and I'd love to know why that is.
I think there's a really interesting paper that came out a couple of years ago about the offshore aggregations of bass and sharks along the northeast coast of the States into kind of Newfoundland, and there was these huge reports of like 2,000 individuals way offshore. It's really interesting. Some of the genetic sampling is trying to get into that they're looking at the close relationship between pods or schools or whatever you want to call them of sharks, and that's something that we're trying to look into. Is, you know, say the spring arrivals that turn up, you know, April to June, are they the same ones that are then in the inner isles in the July and August, or do they head off and go somewhere else? And then say the ones that we get on the east coast maybe later in the year, or the ones that end up in Iceland or Norway and things like that. There's just so much to it. Almost the inner isles is the easier part because it's a more consistent thing. All the other ones that randomly turn up in different places, it's so difficult to try and, you know, put that puzzle together.
I think our population around Scotland and indeed the sort of Western Ireland one is relatively small. It's a relic population. And incidentally, looking at Shane's photographs, I'll be sending him an email tomorrow, because I've seen some of the same animals and I've got records of them over several years, which indicate, you know, everything indicates that the numbers that are left are not that substantial. So it's a difficult one to answer. And as far as Cape Breton's concerned, I've sailed a lot up around there. And I saw quite a lot of basking sharks in the more recent years, around 2018 period, especially around areas off Mahone Bay and Halifax. But they were quite a way out. So that was quite unusual. And there were definitely groups there.
Thanks very much. So I think we've actually managed to get through all the questions. The questions have either been answered through the discussion, or also some of our speakers have been writing down answers as we go as well. So I hope everyone's managed to see them. Just as we round up then, as we're just about to leave the call, we have, for anyone who can spare just a few seconds for our final question, would you support increased protection for basking sharks? I really hope that the answer is 100% yes after this talk, but please be honest, it is anonymous. The results of this are basically something that we can use when it comes to a lot of our marine policy and advocacy work. You know, connecting community engagement with marine policy. So it's useful for us to know. And I'm sure the fact you guys are actually here shows that you care about basking sharks in the first instance anyway. But it's really good to know. Yeah, okay, so we're getting 100%, which is fantastic. All right, listen, I realise we're a bit over just now. I would just like to, on behalf of all our speakers, just say thank you so much again to everyone who's joined this webinar. This is the first webinar in a series of 6. The next one will run next week, and it's all about seagrass and native oyster restoration. You can find all the webinars on Eventbrite under the Scottish Wildlife Trust's page. So do have a look. We've got an incredible lineup of speakers who'll continue to carry on this series. A big thank you again to Colin, to Shane, to Rebecca, to Jess and Jill, who are in the background as well, helping out with a lot of our admin stuff. Thank you so much again. Take care.
Cheers, everyone. Thanks for coming.
Thank you.
Thank you. Bye.